Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we are unpacking a really fascinating piece of cultural analysis that takes a huge magnifying glass to the idea of international friendship. We often hear about these deep historical bonds between certain nations, right? Stories passed down that paint this picture of absolutely perfect mutual understanding. But how much of that is actual reality and how much is just a romanticized cultural myth? Well, we're going to deconstruct the relationship between Japan and Turkey. It's a bond that's often celebrated in Turkey as this profound mutual brotherhood. But as you'll see, looking at it from the Japanese perspective reveals a very different, highly nuanced picture. Okay, let's dive into this. Do the Japanese really know Turkey? I mean, if you ask the average person in Turkey, the answer is a resounding yes. There's this widespread belief that the Japanese harbor a deep, knowledgeable love for Turkish culture. But our source material today challenges those preconceived notions right out of the gate. We're going to separate the comfortable illusions from the everyday realities of how these two very distinct societies actually view one another from thousands of miles away. Moving into Section 1, Sympathy is not knowledge. Let's take a closer look. Now, to really understand this foundational thesis, let's establish exactly where these insights are coming from. The author of our source material, he isn't just a tourist passing through. He's lived in Japan since the year 2000. He is married to a Japanese citizen, and he spent 7 years as a student there before even entering academia. And for the last 4 years, he's been teaching a special course specifically on the Turkish economy at Fukuoka University. So the info we're looking at isn't based on just passing observations. It's distilled from decades of deep academic, professional, and personal interaction right inside Japanese society. So what is the actual extent of Japanese knowledge about Turkey? Well, the Japanese education system focuses pretty heavily on its immediate neighbors, like China and Korea, along with the West. Turkey, it gets maybe a few pages in a history or geography textbook. Because of that, the average Japanese person's mental map of Turkey is kind of reduced to just a few tourism and news symbols. We're talking the hot air balloons of Cappadocia, Istanbul, kebabs, the famous stretchy Morash ice cream, and sadly, recent news about devastating earthquakes. It's a pretty fragmented picture. And this brilliantly illustrates what the author calls the mirror effect. It's super easy for Turkish folks to feel a bit disappointed that Japan's knowledge is so basic, but let's actually look at the reflection for a second. What does the average Turkish person actually know about Japan? Samurai, anime, sushi, maybe the bullet train. The irony here is pretty thick, isn't it? The Turkish perception of Japan is just as superficial and reliant on pop culture symbols as the Japanese perception of Turkey. It is completely a two-way street of limited, symbol-based understanding. All right, Section 2. Real traces of history. Fact versus fiction. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is these 3 major historical milestones. Turkish people firmly believe these events define their cultural bond with Japan. We've got the tragic sinking of the Ertuğrul frigate off the Japanese coast back in 1890, the Turkish Airlines evacuation of Japanese citizens from Tehran in 1985, and the Japanese concerts of Turkish rock legend Barış Manço in the 1990s. But how are these actually remembered in Japan today? Let's break down the myth versus the reality. Over in Turkey, the 1890 Ertuğrul frigate disaster, where locals in Kushimoto rescued stranded Ottoman sailors, is taught as common knowledge. But in Japan, honestly, unless you live in the town of Kushimoto, you likely have never heard of it. The author even notes that most of his university students have no idea what it is. However, the reality? That's the 1985 Tehran evacuation. During the Iran-Iraq War, when Japan couldn't extract its own citizens, Turkish Airlines literally flew in to rescue hundreds of Japanese nationals. For Japanese people over 50, this is a profound, living memory. They will genuinely tell the author, Turkey didn't forget us. And then we have the Barış Manço reality check. In Turkey, there is this widespread belief that the late musician Barış Manço is a household name in Japan because of his wildly successful tours there. But the reality presented in the source is way more niche. He was invited to Japan by a specific Buddhist movement called Soka Gakkai, and he even got a medal from their university. While he might be known within that specific community, which, by the way, itself faces significant criticism in Japan, the general Japanese public, they really don't know who he is. Moving on to Section 3, 2 different Turkeys in media, news versus travel. How a country is broadcast heavily dictates how it's actually perceived. And the Japanese are essentially watching two completely different versions of Turkey on television, which builds a sort of split personality in the public's mind. On the evening news, Turkey is portrayed through a super heavy lens of geopolitical stress. We're talking devastating earthquakes, complex politics surrounding President Erdogan, the Russia-Ukraine war, and refugee crises. It looks highly unstable. But flip the channel to a travel show and you see this exotic paradise full of hot air balloons, the Bosphorus, ancient historic sites, and just incredibly warm hospitality. Adding to that news landscape, there's a recent and highly specific media focus we need to look at. The source details how Japanese media has been heavily covering the Kurdish community from Turkey, specifically those residing in the Saitama prefecture, in cities like Kawaguchi and Warabi. Many arrive seeking asylum, but without official refugee status, they hold temporary or illegal status. Now, the source reports this has led to visible friction with local Japanese residents. They cite issues of integration, the sudden appearance of Turkish language warning signs in local parks, and a highly publicized recent incident involving the death of a Kurdish individual in Japanese police custody. This is a complex real-world issue, and it is actively shaping modern Japanese perceptions right now.
Okay, let's get into Section 4, Food, Questions, and Stereotypes. Everyday Perceptions.
If there is one thing the Japanese absolutely know, it's the kebab. Walk through pretty much any big Japanese city, and you are going to see these Turkish kebab shops. But here is the fascinating twist. The author notes that these shops are rarely ever run by actual Turkish people. They're mostly operated by Iranians, Pakistanis, Uzbeks, or Moroccans. Yet local Japanese people, they don't mind at all. In fact, there's a widespread belief in Japan that Turkish cuisine is one of the three great world cuisines, right alongside French and Chinese. So the food is arguably Japan's absolute strongest and most positive point of interest, even if the guy slicing the meat isn't actually Turkish. Now, inside the classroom, our author gets this rapid-fire barrage of very specific questions from his students year after year. Are Turks Arab? Is it safe? Is everyone Muslim? Do women have to wear hijabs? Is alcohol banned? And, while these might seem a bit ignorant at first glance, they stem entirely from that limited media exposure we talked about. The Japanese media tends to just lump the entire Middle East into one giant homogeneous block. So when the author actually explains that women with and without hijabs live side by side in cities like Istanbul or Izmir, and that alcohol is definitely not banned, his Japanese students are genuinely totally surprised. So that brings us to Section 5, Separating Politics and People, a Mental Distinction. So the crucial point is, how do the Japanese process all of this totally conflicting information? Well, this quote right here is arguably the most important observation in the entire source material. The author states, they make a mental distinction between the state and the people. And wow, that is an incredible sign of societal maturity. Despite the negative news cycles, the geopolitical drama, or even the local community frictions we discussed just a minute ago, the Japanese do not hold individual Turkish people responsible for their government's politics or the actions of a few. And guys, this matters tremendously. Because of that mental distinction, interpersonal interactions remain incredibly warm. When a Japanese person meets a Turkish person, the conversation doesn't suddenly turn into an interrogation about Middle Eastern geopolitics. Not at all. It turns to food, travel, and genuine human curiosity. The author notes that even a Japanese person who follows highly critical international news will still treat a Turkish individual with the absolute utmost warmth and sincerity. Because true international relations, the author argues, are built exactly right here, on grassroots, human-to-human interactions, not high-level state diplomacy. And finally, Section 6, True Friendship Surpasses Symbols. So where does the relationship go from here? Well, to evolve beyond basic stereotypes, the narrative really needs to expand way beyond just kebabs and hot air balloons. The author suggests that because Japan highly respects science and technology, highlighting Turkish university collaborations and scientific achievements would actually make a massive impact. Furthermore, there's just a huge untapped potential in contemporary arts. Nobel laureate Orhan Pamuk is somewhat known, and filmmaker Nuri Bilge Ceylan has a bit of a niche following. But modern Turkish cinema, contemporary literature, and its vibrant youth and entrepreneurial ecosystems, they remain largely undiscovered in Japan. So we're going to end on this really critical question. Are we ready to show them the real Turkey? Sympathy is great, but sympathy without actual knowledge is fragile. The 102-year diplomatic relationship has been built on positive feelings and comfortable, romanticized symbols. But as this explainer has shown, real, lasting friendship only truly begins when both sides put down the caricatures, the samurai and the kebabs, and start embracing the complex, beautiful, and sometimes messy reality of who they actually are today. I'll leave you to think about that. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.